Hello, everyone. My name is Arthur Lindo. I'm a solutions architect here at IDERA, and I represent a suite of products with ER Studio. ER Studio is a fantastic documentation tool for your database and data modeling needs. I'm assuming that you all are very familiar with Aqua Data Studio and Aqua Data, and so I'm going to explain to you why ER Studio would be used in conjunction with Aqua Data Studio. So as you know, Aqua Data Studio is a fantastic tool for data augmentation and data work and working within your database to change schema, to take a look at some of the data points and visualize some of that information as well. With ER Studio, you can take your data modeling. It also has a bit of data modeling in there too. The unfortunate thing about it is that it's limited to just showing tables, views, indexes, and constraints. And it's also only available to model the physical databases. In ER Studio, you can take your modeling to the next level. And one of the benefits of doing this is that you can then share your data models with external users for many different reasons. One is to allow these different users, these business users, to self-serve this information, to understand where their data is, and also solicit more information about this data so they can add additional context around this information so they know not only where it's located, but what its purpose is and where it came from, and all the other additional metadata that surrounds and provides context to these data assets. So what I'm showing you here is Data Architect. Data Architect is the thick client that allows you to do your data modeling. There are 3 different additions to this tool. There's Data Architect, which is what I'm showing you here. There's also the second level, which is Professional Edition. The Professional Edition comes with a repository. This repository holds all of your modeling information. It allows groups of modelers to then check in and check out their information, their modeling, as well as share objects across different model files. The third edition is Enterprise Team Edition. That comes with 2 additional thick clients. There's software architect, for your UML modeling, and there's business architect for your business process modeling, as well as conceptual modeling. In addition to those thick clients, you also have the ability to reverse engineer from not just database sources, but also flat file sources like JSON and XML, as well as BI sources like Tableau or QlikView or QlikSense, and also ETL sources such as Talend or Informatica or SSIS. When you reverse engineer these, this gives the benefit of understanding the data origination, the pathway of where this data actually came from. You could record it all the way back to where it came from in a particular application, and go forward all the way to the data warehouse or data mart that it's now sitting in that's being used by the visualizations. And then, of course, what reports are actually using those. In addition to Enterprise Team Edition, we also have another offering called Team Server Core. This Team Server Core is a web component. This enhances or provides additional visibility of your models to the greater business user. So business users can create their glossaries and terms. They can link their terms to the assets that you have in your data models. They can see your data models. It's one license, unlimited number of users, and they can then self-serve all of this information for understanding their data infrastructure. Now, this is an enterprise level. It can be used as it's meant to be used as an enterprise level tool, but it can be used in a singular fashion as well. So if you're a DBA and you're doing this database development in ADS, maybe you want to provide, or maybe your business users want to see how this data is translated, and they want to add additional information to that. Now, there's 2 ways of going about it. ADS can export, and the reason there's a nice overlap here is that ADS supports many of the platforms that ER Studio also supports. So in ADS, you can script out your databases, your platforms for those, and ER Studio can then ingest those via via a metadata bridge here. And with Enterprise Team Edition, of course, you have this ability to import file from an existing metadata bridge. Now you can export that DDL and you can import that DDL directly from a particular file type. So if it's NoSQL, you can ingest from JSON, or you can ingest from XML as well from a flat file. Or if you export it, you can also ingest a fixed length as well. There's loads of different metadata bridges here, and there's plenty enough, I'm sure, that will satisfy your needs. Now, you can also reverse engineer an existing database. The benefit of this is that when you reverse engineer the existing database, you get all of that DBA implemented metadata, constraints, triggers, all of that kind of stuff. So if I go here to reverse engineer, I can connect to any of these database platforms via native connection. Those that aren't present here, and we're not going to be adding any more to this native connection because it's a pain to keep up to date, we're going to just add the additional support inside the tool, but to connect to that database, you would use an ODBC driver. So for instance, we support, fully support, a good number of platforms. The newest ones that we've added are, we've brought Azure SQL Database up to date. We've also incorporated Azure SQL Synapse. Well, actually, that's coming in the next version. And we also included Redshift and Snowflake. And by full support, what I mean is, that's not a file, it's a system. Oh, I wanted to go just our drivers. So I have a Redshift driver here. I have Postgres as well. We brought that up to current currency. And then of course, Snowflake as well. Now, by full support, what I mean is essentially round tripping. So with ER Studio, you can reverse engineer your database. You can make changes to your model, because when you reverse engineer, it's going to create a logical model as well as a physical model. So here's where I can create I can choose which database I want to connect to. And of course, I can also limit it by the owners. Some platforms call them schemas, other platforms call them roles. We just chose the owners moniker. Now, these are all the different object types that you can reverse engineer. I'm just going to leave it as user tables. And I'm going to bring over, take a couple of these out because it's a sandbox for me. And then I'm going to click next. And here's where you can infer your primary and foreign keys based on names and indexes. So that's a key component if you're not really familiar with the database, but you're an ADS user. So I'm assuming that you are familiar with the database and whether you should do this or not. What I usually suggest to folks, especially when they're starting to get into master data management, is to infer your domains. A domain in this case is a shared attribute. The shared attribute can be used throughout your entire model to define columns. So say, for instance, maybe you have one definition for address. It's a nvarchar 30, right? And you can use that same definition throughout your model, whether that column name is shipping address or customer address or client address. They should all have the same definition, right? Because they're all an address. You can then share that information. But this will create these domains for you, and it'll create a domain for each unique column that it finds in the database. That uniqueness is found by the column name, the data type, and the data type length. Now I'm going to click next. Here's where you can choose whether this is a relational or dimensional model, as well as include a naming standards template if you have one. I don't have one, but the tool allows me to create one. So when I click finish, this is going to create a logical model as well as a physical model. Now, the logical model and the physical model are loosely connected to one another, meaning that they're essentially isolated, except that this still has an understanding of what items came from our link to what items. So that knows that this employee's table is linked to this employee's entity, right? But if I make a change in here, it's not going to automatically change in my physical model, which is handy, right? Because many people don't like a tool that makes changes to things that they're not expecting. I'm one of those people. Anyway, in the logical model, typically this is more of a business-facing object. So I'm going to change the layout to orthogonal because it makes more sense in my brain. Slide some of these things down. And as you can see, there's a really pretty comprehensive ERD that's populated for you. You can change this layout if you want to go into diagram and object display options, and you can change the layout to show, the attributes if you want, the entities, keys, definition. Oftentimes, since this is a business facing image, I oftentimes just show the definition here. And that way I can put in a particular definition to further define this table or entity, sorry. To further define this, I can go into definition and say this categorizes, oh my gosh, I cannot spell today, supplier products, for instance. And I'm heavy with the shift key. And say, okay, so now when a business user sees this, they can see, oh, this isn't just a table, really. This is more of a business term. So they have a business term with a business definition. They can understand this. They can see how it relates to other objects. You can also change the layout of this in that you can insert other objects as well to kind of tranche these models up. So if you have a really large model, you can do that one of two ways. One is through the use of submodeling. So I highlight some of these and I can create a submodel. Maybe this belongs to the product group. And now I have a product submodel. I still have those objects up here, and I can also change the layout to this particular object or this this model, this submodel. So I can change the layout here, but it's not going to change in the main model. But if I do make a change schema-wise, adding columns, changing relationships, if I do that in the main model, those changes will cascade down to the submodel. Any changes that I make similar will automatically cascade up. And I can have submodels all the way down. So I can break up very large models into very minute, digestible pieces. And I can also, in the Professional and Enterprise Team Edition, inside the repository, I can also add securities for viewing and monitoring and changing these things. Now, as a DBA, you're probably not really concerned about modeling. And in fact, you're only made to do this because there's some sort of need to see the documentation, or you're doing this out of self-preservation because you're being asked of what tables are where and where should they get this particular information. And those kind of questions are taking a lot of time out of your day. So if you just generate this data model and provide that to the business, they can self-serve this information. Now, to provide this to the business, once you've created your physical model and your logical model and so forth, you can go to tools and you can generate your reports here. And you can generate a report that looks very similar to the model that I've created here. And it actually will include all of your additional information. And you can put in loads of information, attachments to objects, additional information, which I'll go into. But you can generate all report out for this. And you can do it in an RTF or an HTML report. The RTF looks more like a DBA data dictionary than it does a business-friendly document. So I prefer the HTML when you're presenting this out to the business. I don't have anything in data lineage or data dictionary or anything, so I'm just going to click finish. I didn't add images. Boo. I'm going to have to do that again. Let's do that again. Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't like that it keeps popping up on the other one. So I'm going to select everything here and then fast forward. And here are the ERDs that I can include. And I can choose which image type that I want those to be in. Now, click finish. I can then open this up in a web browser here. And then the business user can then go through this. They can take a look at the logical model, which they might be interested in. And I can choose which objects I want to present here. I can include and disclude anything inside here. So a business user can actually click on an object. They can see all the columns. They can see the usage. They can see the constraints and so forth. And this is basically their first stop to understanding where this information is held and how they would query this and understand it. Now, you can provide the additional context to these data objects, or you can use that document to solicit this information that you then need to put into your database. So for instance, maybe you have data rules or business rules that affect your data. Maybe there's constraints that you need someone to flag inside here. So if there are specific constraints to your data, like not constraints, but compliances that particular data points have to abide by, like maybe it's PII or CCPA or GDPR, you can flag these objects as having those particular compliances. And then as a DBA, you would know that these particular data points have to be handled in a certain way. Maybe there's masking, maybe there's obfuscation, or maybe there's deletion or redaction. either way, this is a way for you to see these flags and understand that these changes need to occur. Now we do have questions open, so if you want to ask questions while I'm going through this, feel free. You can do that in the chat or in the questions portion of your viewer here. The next bit for this is the data dictionary. Oh, actually, before we go into data dictionary, I want to go into the data model here. So I have the physical model and the logical model. As you can see, the logical model is not tied to a specific database platform. It says, in fact, it just says down here, logical model. If I click on the physical model, you can see that it's tied to a Microsoft SQL Server 2016. Now, what I can do in ER Studio is I can make a change to my model, which is essentially my documentation, right? In a perfect world, your physical databases don't change unless the documentation first changes, right? Especially if you're trying to keep up documentation, because nobody likes doing that. But if you have an organization that enforces good policy of documenting first, changing after, through the process of acceptance, of course, then you would change your model here, and I'm going to add a field here, call it title. And of course, as you can see, since I used a domain, all of this information, the data type, the defaults, rules, constraints, reference values, all that stuff is actually grayed out. I can override that if I want, but the grayed out means that it's already been defined in the domain. And then I can say, okay. So I've added a field here. So this is in my physical model, but it's not over in my database. So to change that, I could right click on this and I can go and use compare and merge. Now this compare and merge utility is really powerful in that I can compare this model to another model in this same DM1 file, so I can keep my logical and physical models congruent. I can also compare against another model in another DM1 file. I can compare against a repository-based DM1 file if this is in if I have the professional edition or enterprise team edition, the repository. And again, I can also, with the physical model, I can compare against a SQL file if I want. I can also compare against the live database, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to compare this to the database that I reverse engineered at the very beginning. I'm going to log in to my server. I'm going to choose the database that I want to compare and the owner for schema that I want. And of course, these are the objects and all of their properties that I want to compare. Let's leave that as the same. And because I know what I changed, I'm just going to choose those objects to compare. But I can also compare all of these different objects as well, and it'll bring those differences in. I'm going to click next, and this is going to show me the differences. So obviously there's a difference between categories, and I have this checked to show only difference. If I undo that, then, well, I only chose one thing to show, but if I have a list of objects that I wanted to compare, I can choose to only show those that have differences, which makes it a little easier to go through this. Now, I have added a title here, but it's going to throw off the sequences, right? Now, I have a choice here. I can choose to bring in the schema information from the database and write over what I have in my model, or I can generate a script that will produce change DLL that will could then be run on the database. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the information from the model and push that into my database. Now I can report this information out, the RTF or HTML, and put that, combine that with the SQL. Oops, I'm going to cancel. And I can combine that report with the SQL that's going to be created here, this change SQL, and goes out to this default location that you can set in your tools options. But I can combine that with this SQL that's going to be created, and I can then submit it for acceptance. Oh, that's a bummer. Why? Oh, let me. So notice here I have Aqua Data Studio, and I also have Universal iSQL. Universal iSQL is a included tool inside this inside the ER Studio, but it has a lot of limitations. It only connects to a small number of database platforms, and that's why we're talking about Aqua Data Studio, because Aqua Data Studio, as you know, connects to a vast number of database platforms. So I'm going to compare and merge again. And I'm going to proceed, and I'm going to compare against my database, and I'm going to generate this change SQL login. I'm just going to fast forward through this because want to this time open it up in Aqua Data Studio. Next. So I'm going to push this into my database like I did before. Click next. And here I have a choice to open this in Aqua Data Studio, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to click finish. Do I want to override it? Yes, I do. And this will open it up in Aqua Data Studio. I do not have a connection to my database, so I'm going to open it in my text editor. And here you can see that because I added the field to the middle of the table, it's going to rename the old index, rename the old table, create the new table with the new field, and then it's going to insert into the new table the information from the old table. And of course, it's going to create your SQL to add your constraints and foreign keys and so forth and indexes. So through Aqua Data Studio, you can run this directly on your server if you have the permissions to do so. So you can see a little bit about how ER Studio and Data Studio kind of complement one another. The other complementation that you have is you have this visualization tool inside Aqua Data Studio. This visualization tool can show you statistics of particular columns and tables and the data inside those. And then you can take that information and you can produce or tag the objects inside here, especially when you're talking about, say, data governance. I'm going to create a, I'm going to learn how to type. It's because y'all are watching, I think. So I'm going to create a top folder called called governance. And inside that folder, I'm going to create a new attachment. Now this new attachment, I can specify, I can start flagging things. There's essentially like a flag, right? I can flag or tag objects as having a particular business value, right? Whether it's a high, medium, or low business value. Maybe I'm talking about data quality. Maybe it's a high, medium, low data quality. Let's do that. Data quality. And then I can say high data quality is less than 10% nulls. Maybe that's my check. And then my low is greater than 50% nulls. Maybe I just have that. So what I'm going to do, and I'm missing a bunch in between, and maybe there's a medium. Medium is greater than 10% and less than 50%. Whatever I want to do. And of course, for my values, I can then put in a text list. I'm just giving a definition of how high, medium, and low is calculated. And then I can also say undefined here and say, okay. Now with active Aqua Data Studio, I can then go back here and I can start querying my database to understand how many nulls are in a particular column or how many nulls are in this table or so forth and start. Then I can then come back to this tool and then I can then go into a particular column or I can associate this data quality with a particular table and say whether this table has a high, medium, low, or undefined data quality. I can do the same thing for columns. So I go in here to my attachments and I can add data quality and say, okay. Now I can't see that in my model, so I'm going to change my diagram and display options and choose to show attachments and their values as well as data security and their values. So now I can see that in this table, there's a data quality is undefined. Now you can't see that I have that in the column here. So what I did is I created a macro. These macros are written in WinRat Basic. They're held, there's a good number of them. Arthur Lint macros aren't for y'all, but all of these come included. And you can do this kind of conditional formatting through it. And like I said, this is like a IDE for your WinRat Basic. If you know Visual Basic or you know how to do macros in Excel, it's very similar to that. And the macro that I had created was to color attributes that have attachments. So it it bolds it and makes it purple because I like the color. But you can do this type of conditional formatting, not just the fact that it has an attachment, but also for the value of that attachment. So that way your business users, or even you as a DBA, can see what these particular values or what these columns have in store as far as data quality, or even retention periods, or business value, like I said. Now you can also flag things as having a particular security measure. So say right click on this and say generate your security information, and this will generate all of your compliances that you may come across that you have to accommodate in your data models. Now, just because this is here doesn't mean that you actually know what columns need to be specified. So this is where you can then report this information out, and you can ask or solicit this information to be populated. You can also use a macro to export specific objects out. So you can export the object definition and notes to Excel, and you can give this to the business and say, hey, I would like you to add definition and notes here, and then import that through a macro as well. So you can do this bulk editing, and it allows you to solicit this information for other people to import this input this information in another mechanism, and then bulk insert that information into this tool. You can also specify your privacy levels and stuff like that. And just like attachments, if I wanted to do a bulk attachment, I just set my default to whatever I want. And then I can go into, say, entities. I'm in my physical model. So I can just start clicking around and saying, these are the entities that have that security setting, and say, okay. So now I can see that these all have a compliance mapping of none here, but they're added, and I can add them in bulk, and I can edit them in singularly if I want. So maybe this has PII in it. Say okay. Now you can also specify your defaults for particular columns, your rules for particular columns, so they have to be all upper, all lower, or fall within a particular range or what have you. And then also document your reference values for lookups. And of course, you also have a naming standards template. This naming standards template allows you to manage the naming standard differences between the logical model and the physical model, or for substitution, things like that. So say, for instance, if you have, and also do cases, so uppercase, lowercase, camel case, upper camel, lower camel. And also substitution, like for instance, maybe in your logical model, you have customer, but in the physical model, because in the database, it's different, it just says cust. You can handle those type of naming conventions. You can also specify user data types, and then of course brings us to domains. Now, a domain, like I said before, is a shared attribute. It has the same definition as any other column or attribute. So you can specify, and these are logical, so obviously they are attributes. The reason they're logical data types is because you can have multiple different physical models based on different platforms in this tool, inside this DM1 file. So you can define this city in one location, set the defaults, rules, constraints, everything else. But if I go to deep binding information, I can see by showing all currently bound objects that city is being used in all 4 of these locations. But if you notice there's a ship city over here in the orders table. Remember at the beginning when I said reverse engineer domains, it'll create a unique domain for each, it'll create a domain for each unique column that it reverse engineers. Well, ship city isn't city as far as the name goes. But what I can do is I can also add that to this. So if I go into orders, I go down to ship city, click that and say, okay. So now ship city is also using that same city definition. If I go here, you can see it's using that same city definition. Now, if I change city's definition, this domain's definition, it's going to make that change throughout my entire model. So it makes managing this type of stuff really easy. And as I said, this is an enterprise level enterprise level application and suite. So it allows you to, share this information and also broadcast changes from one place to another. Now, in your data model, like I was saying, you can have multiple physical models in the same model file. I'm going to rename this to SQL DW. Now, we support very similar database platforms to Aqua Data Studio. So if I right click on this, I can generate another physical model. And to generate another physical model, I can then choose any of these database platforms to generate this physical model for. So I'm sure you can I'm sure you can see how this tool allows you to lift and shift from one model or a database platform to another database platform. So if I could go from SQL to say maybe Hive, and I'm going to say Hive, but we have a number of different database platforms that we support. I'm sure you'll probably find one that fits your needs. And then I'm going to just click Finish. So this is going to create a Hive model right here. Now it follows the same layout initially as the logical model. So I'm going to change this to show the attribute ordering and say, okay. Oh, that's what I wanted to do. I also wanted to show data types. So I'm going to show data types. And I'm going to highlight all these and click resize. There we go. So now we have all of these different data types, and these are Hive specific data types. Now the way that we do this is through a data type mapping editor, and you can change the different data types and how they map to one platform from the logical to the physical as well. So if I go to SQL DW, you can see that the data types are all SQL specific, but of course in Hive it's different. And Hive's also got a different layout too. I'm going to say tables and so forth. But in Hive, if I double click on a particular object, I now have bucketing, I have skewed by, whereas in SQL, I still have some other stuff, but I don't have skewed by or bucketing. But I do have storage information that I can put in. So there's a lot of information that you can put into this tool that helps convey better understanding to the business of where this information is held. And it also helps you as a DBA to understand how the business, their business rules apply to the data that you're governing. Now, that being said, in Hive, of course, I can right click on this and I can go to generate this database. And in generating this database, I can open this in Aqua Data Studio, and then I can connect to my Hive server, and I can run this from Aqua Data on my Hive server to generate this, or on my Hive database, I can generate these objects. It's really pretty slick that way that works. Now, of course, we have the repository. As I was talking to you before, it allows you to branch and merge, allows you to check in and check out. So if you find that you're starting to grow your data modeling team, this will allow kind of a it's like a source control system where, like I said, you can check in and check out, you can branch and merge, you can create save points, or what we call named releases, and you can reverse engineer from those. You can or compare against those. You can also go into your security center and apply permissions to any of your objects inside here, as well as a project center that you can link your projects to JIRA, so you can apply tasks to check in and check out mechanisms and things like that. Now, we also, inside this data dictionary with the repository, you can, when you check this out, you can, I spent a couple minutes making this repository and all the settings, right? And I've applied these to the model. When I save this and check it into the repository, I can then promote this data dictionary to an enterprise level data dictionary, and other modelers can then use all of these settings that I created, all of the attachments, the data security information, domains, users, defaults. They can use this information as well. So that means that, like I said, it's an enterprise level. So that means that you can administrate, it's not a word, administer all of the changes in this data dictionary to all of the models underneath it. Now, with the repository, you can also do data lineage in this application. The data lineage actually will show you the source to target information. Now, I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with doing ETL, or maybe you have no need to document your ETL, but this is very helpful for the business, especially reports, people that are running reports. You can document your data lineage one of two ways, or both ways if you want. One is through column level data lineage. So say, for instance, maybe my SQL DW, its source is this Hive. I can right click on this and go down to my data movement rules. And I'm going to specify that my source is Hive for this. I'm also going to sync this information and say, okay. So now if I go into categories, I can then specify under my columns for say category name, I can then go over to my data lineage here, and I can say that this is coming from Hive. As you can see, there's a category name, and maybe I'm doing a trim on this. And I can say what trim does. It removes leading and trailing spaces. All right, so now when someone clicks on this column through the reporting mechanism that I showed you before, they'll be able to see the source column is Hive, the table is categories, and the column is category name, and then there's a trim and what that trim does. And say, okay, so that's column level data lineage. And many organizations, yours might be similar, have a Excel spreadsheet that documents this source column to destination column. Well, if you do, you can import that information from domain bindings. Nope, data lineage. You can import that from Excel. I suggest you create one, export that to Excel to see what the layout is, and then copy your information into that layout and then import that directly. So you can do these type of bulk imports as well. Now we also have a tab called data lineage, and this allows you to do visual data lineage, which is shown through creating of a data flow. So I'm going to create a data flow, call this df cat, and I'm going to move information from this categories table in Hive to this categories table in SQL. And most of the documentation happens in this transformation box here, or control. I'm going to specify the direction of data movement, and then by double clicking on this transformation, I can then give it its own name. Maybe it's a stored procedure here, and I can specify the source columns. I can specify the destination columns. And this information you can import with Enterprise Team Edition. You can import this from Talend or Informatica or SSIS as well. I can give this a business definition if I want, how often it's run, who's the author, what it supports, things like that. And I can also put in code. Now the code here is just a text box. It's just a suggestion of what information you should put in. I typically tell people to put in their column mappings here, so that way you can see it. And then in data movement rules, you can specify whether there's an append, an update, a delete. These data movement rules are defined and held here and shared across all of your data flows. And of course, I can add attachments if I want. I'm going to say that this is a direct map and say OK. Now the benefit of this, and this can also represent a report, right? You can show that the report is using these tables. There's the view is querying this information from these tables and use that transformation object to show all that, the source columns, and then the code that's used to select it all. And in doing so, you can then go over to the model and you can see if someone says, hey, we got to change this Hive column, here, this category name, how's that going to affect things downstream? You can just click on that, right click, and go to where used. And this will give you a quick audit of where this column is being used and how it's being used. So as you can see, it's also linked to the objects in the logical model, as well as SQL DW. All right, so that's data lineage. Now, on top of the repository, when you check in your models and things like that, you can also choose to publish to another mechanism that we have called Team Server Core. Now, this Team Server Core is a web component that sits on top and reads from your repository. And like I said, if you choose to take your models to the next level and you want to expose them to a greater audience, you can then publish them to this mechanism and allow those users, once they're published, you can schedule your publishing, you can manually publish, you can automatically publish from ER Studio if you want. And in doing that, you can then, the business user can then go to ER tools and they can start searching up this information. And they can see the different DM1 files. They can go into, the different models, the ERDs. They can click on the eyeballs. They can slide some of these objects around. They don't persist or anything, it just hangs out in this session. But then they can double click on this particular object and know more about it. What are the columns inside here? What are the indexes? If you're a software or an application developer, maybe you need this particular table, so you're just going to copy this DDL and put it into your source to support your application. Of course, then you can see all the submodels, and a business user can then add additional notes. Here, they can add hyperlinks and images and stuff, whatever supports their idea of and context around this particular object. Now I can also search globally for specific objects, like say orders, for instance. And if I'm searching for it globally, I can then find all of those objects that have orders in their name, and I can limit it by the type of object that I'm looking for. Maybe I'm only searching for tables. So I see all these different orders tables and the submodels that they're in. I can see all the breadcrumbs of where they're located and so forth. Now, a business user, in the interest of adding additional context around this information, they can create specific glossaries here. I'm going to clear out some of these. A business user can go in and create specific glossaries. They can also import and load their glossaries and the terms underneath those glossaries. So for instance, I have an accounting and finance glossary, and all of these objects have their own stream, and the stream shows the changes that have occurred to these objects. I can see the different terms. We can have discussions around these objects. Every object in here, I can have discussions with folks around these objects. Of course, only people that are going to see these discussions are those that are following this object. So I am following this, but if I take a look at who is also following this, it's just admin. So I'm kind of in an echo chamber here. But these glossaries can then, of course, have terms underneath those. These terms can then, say accelerated depreciation, this terms can then be linked to ER objects, thereby giving them a higher understanding. So say, for instance, this accelerated depreciation, maybe this is a business group or it's a report, and this report is using all of these different objects. To relate those objects, you just click the Relate tab and you find the object type that you want to limit it by if you want, or you can find your object that you're looking for through pagination, alphabetical, or just by typing in a little bit of what you're looking for, and then just click the Relate button next to it. Now this gives the business a little bit more understanding of kind of the taxonomy of how things are related to one another, and additional context of how these data objects and these data assets are used. Now you can also include data sources, which are essentially just a connection information. So you can provide them this information, this connection information for specific data sources. So for instance, you can, and then you can link these data sources and provide permissions to only those folks that have permissions to this data source so they can see this. And what I typically suggest to folks is I have them relate these to specific ER models. So this data source is related, actually just say, so this data source is related to these models. So that way they know that when they log in through ODBC to query this, this is what that data source looks like. So they can take a look at the image. So they can take a look at the different submodels, they can view the image, and then in that connection, they say, oh, okay, so this is a skill, employee skill, department. So I know that I can query the employees and find all the skills that are associated with each of my employees that are in my department, for instance. Quick and dirty query. So that's ER Studio and how it can enhance your usage of Aqua Data Studio. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful day.